Alright, so we're going to go over some techniques for painting for watercolor and tempera paint. So I'm going to do watercolor on this one and tempera paint on the other one. You always want to start with the very back of your picture first. So in this case, it's the sky. I don't want to paint over my sun, so I'm going to wet my brush first, and I'm going to go over the paper just around where the sun is to wet it so that my blue will go next to the sun but not in the sun. And then I'm going to start adding the blue on the top like this, and just be careful to not get in the sun. Like so. And with watercolor you kind of have to move fairly quickly, so I went ahead and mixed up my colors first. And if you see that it's not moving as much on the paper, then you might need just a little bit more water. Now that I've got some started, now I'm just going to kind of pull the paint down, and it's okay if I overlap my mountains a little bit. Can also, if you want to make like clouds in your sky, you can use a paper towel to kind of dab out some of the color while it's still wet. You can also wet your paintbrush. I'm going to wipe it off on the side a little bit, and I can kind of pick up some of that color. By re-wetting and then dabbing a little bit more, and that'll kind of give me a cloud. And then I'm going to let that dry before I do the mountains, because remember, if part of your painting's still wet and I try to paint the mountains right now, it's just going to bleed into my sky. When you're working with watercolor, you're going to work in sections. So the next section I will do, I think, is the grass. And I'm just going to go right over my trees. I start a little bit with yellow, and then I'm going to go in and get my green. Because remember, it's going to be lighter towards the top, and it's going to get darker as we go down. Things in the distance look a little bit lighter. So as you can see, I'm still moving pretty quickly. I'm trying to keep this bottom edge of my paint right here wet, because as long as it's wet, it's going to move down and not create a harsh line. But as soon as it starts to dry, that's when we start to get those weird lines and things in our painting. I'm going to add a little bit of blue towards the bottom to darken up this green a little bit. So with landscapes, because we want them to look three-dimensional, it's important to kind of layer your colors so you don't have just a flat color. And then I'm going to let that dry for a little bit, and then go on to, while that's drying, I'm going to go on to my tempera paint one. I already mixed up some colors for it. And so again, the sky is going to be a little bit darker towards the top. I'll start with my sky. I'm going to try to go around the sun the best I can. And you don't want your paint too thick. I might have gotten it a little bit thick right there. is still wet, it's going to blend pretty easily. But once it starts drying on the paper, you're gonna find it harder to blend. I'll put some of this really light blue close to these mountains. And I'm kind of trying to keep my brush going fairly the same direction as I'm blending. With tempera paint, one of the reasons I say don't use water is because it's water soluble. So if your paintbrush is wet, it's going to reactivate the paint on your paper. So sometimes you can use water if you mess up. So I'm going to get my brush wet in the water, and then I'm going to kind of wipe it off on the edge because I don't want it too wet. And right here where I got some paint in my sun, I'm just going to kind of wet it so that I can pick up that color. I'll rinse off my brush again and wipe it off. And so this is a technique you can use if you accidentally paint over something you didn't mean to paint over. Just go in there and kind of clean it up by picking up the color with just a clean, wet paintbrush. You don't want to rub the paper too hard though, because you'll damage the paper. Then I think I'm going to go ahead and make my mountains purple. Go ahead. I'm going to go around this tree though, because I don't want my purple in the tree. That'll look weird. And then I'm going to go in with my dark purple and start to add kind of some shadows and shading to my mountains. And the sun's come this way, so the shadows are going to be mostly on the right side. For the grass, I'm going to go ahead and move to this bigger brush, this flat brush, because it'll give me more area to work with. So I'm going to start with the really light green at the top, and I'm just going to use the edge of this flat brush to kind of go in right next to my mountains. And I kind of got the yellow on this side and the darker green towards the bottom of my brush to kind of help me blend. And these are supposed to look 3D because they're landscapes, so I want to kind of blend some colors in there so that my color is not all flat on my painting. Now when I go in to paint my trees, I'm going to use a smaller brush, and I'm going to start with this one, I think, and kind of dab, like so that it just dab the paintbrush, the tip of the paintbrush on, so it looks kind of like tree leaves. Gives it a little bit of texture. And do this tree in the back. Remember, things as they get further away get lighter, so I'm making sure that this is a lighter green. still going to wait for this to dry a little bit before I add the yellow on top, because I don't want it to mix with that blue and make a grain. So now I'm going to check this one. It's still a little bit wet. And I can tell by using the back of my hand it's still a little bit cold. So because it's still a little bit wet, I'm going to go ahead and use a hairdryer and dry it. And get my brush just a little bit wet, and I'm going to go in with this purple I already mixed. And I think I'll start on this side. This side is going to be a little bit darker. Because the sun's coming this way. Then I'm going to rinse my brush off a little bit so that I can drag the rest of this purple over. So I'm going to the edge and I'm just kind of dragging it. And like pushing it along. And I'm going to do the same thing on this other mountain. So I'm going to start on this side with the dark purple. And then I'm going to clean my brush off some, dry it just a little bit so that I can start pushing the purple to the other side of the mountain. This gives me a nice value change. Now that my mountains are done, I can go in and work on my trees a little bit more. I'm going to mix a little more green. And then I'm going to take this green and I am just going to kind of make some squiggly lines, some dots, just to kind of give it the texture of a tree. Kind of pretending like I'm scribbling with my paintbrush. And I'm going to make some brown for the tree trunks, although I'm going to have to wait for the trees to dry a little bit. So brown is opposite colors on the color wheel. You can use orange and blue. Usually make a pretty nice brown. Maybe a little too blue. I'm going to add some more orange to that. There we go. I'm getting a pretty nice brown. I think my tree is pretty close to dry right here. I'm just gonna not touch the green that I just did on my tree. I'm gonna paint my trunk. And so now I'm gonna go in and do my sun. I already have this yellow mixed up. And I could probably go ahead and do the sun on my tempera paint one as well. And because I remember I did get a little bit of blue in this, I might have to let this dry and do another layer of yellow over it to cover up that blue I accidentally got in the sun. But I don't know, it looks pretty good so far. So those are some painting techniques that you can use, some for watercolor and some for tempera. I would even go in more and probably add a little bit of grass details and do a little more detailing on some of the edges of these mountains, but that gives you a good start on some techniques that you can use for painting.